Psychoanalysis and Philosophy, session 12. In session 11, we took up 5 issues which had come up as questions to me. 5 more questions. We'll take it up in this session. We'll answer those 5 questions in a thematic discussion. So I've converted those questions into themes of discussion. So let's get into those 5 more themes of discussion in the area. The first theme that has come up is of subjectivity. And this question has come to me in the context of postmodernism. Postmodernism stretches subjectivity to its extreme relativism and takes up almost an extreme position in its phonetic form, as though no law exists, no objective reality exists in this world. And how does it stand in the context of philosophy and psychoanalysis? So let us touch upon some of the aspects in this discussion. One way to look at subjectivity and objectivity is to look at consensus that we have on things, on ideas. And no one can deny that we do have consensus as a species about many things and about many ideas. And without any question, that store becomes a store of objective reality. Objective reality, of course, is qualified by the fact that it is objective reality of the human species. If the apparatus of knowing changes, obviously the objective reality changes. But even if the apparatus changes, there is a point of view to say that the change of apparatus can add or subtract from what is perceived, but cannot negate the existence of that small part of reality that the apparatus is able to perceive. So if you have 5 senses and you know certain things about reality, if you have 7, you would know more. If you have 3, you would know less. But whatever area you know, even if you keep on enhancing your number of senses, you know more, but what a person with few senses would know, that is not negated. The factuality of that reality continues. So to see objective reality in a limited way is very different from saying objective reality does not exist. These are completely different arguments. So when we talk about subjectivity in psychoanalytic area, this is very central, that we are dealing with extremely subjective phenomena. At the same time, we are dealing also with objective phenomena. The epistemology of thinking, the fundamental feelings we have, the psychodevelopmental stages we pass through, the commonality we see in pathogenesis and healing area, the commonality that we see in normal processing of information in ordinary everyday context, all of that are the areas of objectivity. And then there is this whole area of dreams, of free associations, of selective attention, of selective response, which is an area of subjectivity. Subjectivity is not actually an opposite of objectivity. The difficulty is when you put it on a continuum and you don't have a higher theory to connect the two. Then you see only the continuum and there is no connection between the two ends of the continuum. But if you look at it from a synthesizing philosophical standpoint, which I have put up in my philosophy of heat, rather a psychophilosophical model of heat. In that sense, if we look at any state of the mind, any state of the human integer, then subjectivity, whenever it manifests, and if you are extreme subjectivist, you would say right from birth to death, whatever the case be, we cannot deny that it is a state. It may be a series of states flowing very fast, but you cannot deny that there is a state. There can also be a flow, but there is also the state. It's not only one. There is the flow and there is the state. Now, if we look at state of subjectivity, then that state is created by more fundamental elements. For example, if I am in a particular state of wonder looking at a good mountain, there will be activation of elements of wonder, elements of happiness, elements of awe, hyperactivity of my sensual apparatus. So if we look at it from a structural point of view, then every state is variables taking particular values. And if that being so, the state of subjectivity also can be explained from a structural standpoint. And if we look at it from a suprahuman standpoint, where we have elementals that make up the human being and take him through various states by taking different values, then every state of subjectivity becomes one specific instance of a giant collection of states, a giant objectivity. So then every subjectivity becomes a specific instance of a giant objectivity, and the objectivity then contains subjectivity. In that context, subjectivity is an objective fact. When you stretch subjectivity to absurdity in the extreme postmodern fanatical context, you get into the position of annihilation of science, annihilation, what Immanuel Kant used to face, the problem of annihilation of law, dissolution of law. Because if there is no law whatsoever, then the concept of science automatically goes out of the window. Not only pure science, all sciences go out of the window. To convert our inability to create a coherent theory into a philosophical proposition that law does not exist. I'm not talking about legal law, I'm talking about law in a fundamental context. So to convert our inability to create a grand objective theory into a philosophical proposition that the concept of law is dissolved is actually an instance of sour grapes and an act of a bad loser. It's not a wise act in any way. From a philosophical standpoint, it doesn't have any sound foundation. because even those who believe in a perpetual flux, they still believe in the concept of law underlying that perpetual flux. Laws surviving in the middle of that perpetual flux. The dynamism and unpredictability, the unknowability, is by no means something that will lead us to dissolution of the concept of law or dissolution of our capability to know anything, dissolution of the concept of objective knowledge at all, knowledge per se. And here we can also look at subjectivity as the front end of evolution. It is not found in all species. As you see species evolving more, we see subjectivity also evolving more. And when we look at spiritual experiences and transformations of the mystics and spiritual leaders or great leaders, it serves us as an example that they are at the front end of evolution. So good subjectivity is at the front end of evolution. When we talk about extreme subjectivity in the postmodern context, we are also escaping Immanuel Kant's work on the constancy of inner epistemological laws, which have to lead us in certain directions only, and therefore there is a range of possibilities. In most areas, we are dealing with a bounded range phenomena. Within that range, there might be infinite variations, but it is still a bounded range phenomenon. So, subjectivity from a philosophical standpoint is by no means something that inevitably leads us to non-existence of objective knowledge, as the postmodernists would like us to do. And from a postmodern perspective, when you come back to psychoanalysis, you will have to say goodbye to most of the psychoanalytic schools and thousands of hours of hard work, difficult work, complicated work, subtle work, esoteric work, and precious and rare to develop insights, the collection of which already exists in psychoanalysis. We would have to say goodbye to all of it, and that's a stupid thing to do. It's an absurd thing to do. To bring in this extreme postmodern spirit into psychoanalysis is to say goodbye to all that we have done till now. And the postmodernism just becomes a pretext to cover up impulse of freedom to say anything goes. So, to be open is one thing, to respect subjectivity is one thing, but to take these things to an extreme and say that no objective law exists, no objective science exists, is stupidity. It's absurd to say that. In my model of heat, I have taken up a position of open structuralism. It's neither completely structuralism nor completely non-structuralism. It's a position of open structuralism. And that reconciles non-conformity of all phenomena to certain known laws with the humility that all laws are not known and all laws are not all, and the known laws are not all explaining. But that cannot be stretched to absurdity to say no law exists, or we are standing at the boundary of the unknowable. And therefore, this is the limit of human knowing. And if this is the limit, then present subjectivity is going to be eternal subjectivity. And then in the area of unknown, anything goes. So there are some good ideas in the area of postmodernism. To incorporate those ideas in psychoanalysis is good, but to To bring in the spirit is to undo the work of decades of psychoanalysis. And many of the ideas in postmodernism are completely absurd. They are extreme fanatical ideas. So better to save psychoanalysis from a wholesale hijacking by postmodernism. Second question for the day is creating axioms. This question relates to stopping midway in analysis and not taking any social science or psychoanalytic construct down to the elemental philosophical level and how it is working. It's a scholarly question. If we take up democracy, feminism, capitalism as instances to start our discussion, take for example democracy. You today have a large group of people who say, who have grown up listening actually to the point that democracy is an eternally good value, eternally good system, and one should not even think about questioning democracy or thinking about an alternative. They bring about democracy as an idea where they talk about a self-evident truth. That is self-evident, not only in terms of a logical necessity and historical experience analysis, but even by observation outside. And just turn the head on either side of history and observe last 25 years and what is likely to be in the next 25 years. And one can see that democracy being the best system for all times is a self-evident truth. So what they are doing is they are creating an axiom by converting democracy as a self-evident truth. But this is not true. If you go deeper, you can deconstruct it. You can go into elements of any crushing, be it democracy, autocracy, monarchy, and then compare on those elements each of the systems. And democracy also does not work when difficult times come. So it may not be a best system for all countries for all times. Countries may have to take a break from it and come back to it. Countries may have to start undemocratically, develop, and then go democratic. Same with feminism, same with capitalism. They are being talked about as though these are self-evident truths which cannot be reduced further, cannot be deconstructed further, cannot be explained in terms of their elementals. And this is where you start with a construct, analyze it, put whys 3 or 4 times and come to a midpoint, and then don't go further. You just stop here and say, this is a self-evident thing. You are trying to create an axiom midway in analysis, which cannot be done because you cannot escape going to the philosophical foundations. The belief here is that there is no need for foundation, they are the foundation. There is no need to go into the question of individual and society. There is the individual and collectivity. There is no need to go into the whole idea of class analysis. There is no need to go into the idea of archetypal analysis of a society. There is no need to go into the area of spiritual analysis of a society. And you just make these fancy ideas as self-evident truths, which need no foundation, which need no contextual support. They seem to be the foundation themselves. They seem to be eternally good for all times, for all places. It's a way of escaping philosophy because the last 20-25 years of scholars don't really have a deep foundation in philosophy. They have not spent adequate time in reading Aristotle or Socrates or Heidegger or Sartre or Kierkegaard or Immanuel Kant or Hegel. And therefore, this is a kind of a escape from philosophy in ignorance and fear. There is a fear of truth. What if the analysis gets into more fundamental areas and you get a body of work already existing to which we don't have an answer and which demolishes our fashionable ideas? And therefore, there is a tendency not to go into elemental analysis, but to present these ideas as self-evident truths, as ideas with a foundation in themselves, and something which is true for all times to come. And questioning them is like blasphemy. It is like being a medieval barbarian and not being civilized enough for the present times. But this is hardly something that will endure the test of time. You can't sustain an artificial intellectual situation for a long time. Wittgenstein said something very important. He said, the justification of the most justified itself stands unjustified. So the unjustified, the ultimate unjustified is the axiom, but that is deep inside philosophy. It is not on the surface in discourse in social sciences, ordinary social sciences. And these ideas which are being presented to us as self-evident truths, they are not self-evident truths. They need justification like everything else. And the ultimate justification will always stand unjustified. It will be a matter of philosophy and belief. In the area of psychoanalysis, we had, not psychoanalysis, but psychotherapy, we had this behavioral movement, which was on similar lines. A very fashionable idea, presented as self-evident truth as the only scientific method. Later on, it was followed by CBT, presented as the only best method, the only scientific method. These things don't work in the long run. Every school brings with itself something worthy, something valuable that has to be incorporated. But the deeper schools, the deeper inquiry will always get into esoteric areas, philosophical areas, belief areas, axiomatic areas. And we cannot escape the pluralism which comes inevitably out of our incomplete knowledge as a species. Second question to him is of Dasein. Heidegger's concept of Dasein and how it relates to psychoanalysis or psychotherapy. I think one of the things that has happened to the idea of Dasein is it has not focused on the elemental psychological constitution of Dasein. Dasein also needs a state analysis. Being there does not mean being free of psychological states. Being there does not mean being free of historical analysis, historical heritage that is there. Being there does not mean the chakras are not active when you are being there. Being there does not mean the unconscious or superconscious is not active when you are there out in the world. Being there is not a empty secular state. So the Heidegger's concept of Dasein can never be fully understood unless psychoanalysis and spirituality are brought in, not only brought in, but brought in adequately. Because the same is being there in reality, and reality is not ready to end. Much of reality is essence, much of reality is behind the scene, much of reality is not known by us. There is no question of reality being ready to hand. You can at best say contingency, as we know reality, part of it is ready to hand. So the concept of Dasein has to be brought into psychoanalysis adequately. It has not been brought. In fact, two parts of philosophy need to be incorporated, which we have not done. I have tried to do it in my own heat model of the mind. Two areas. One is existential philosophy, and second, epistemology, especially of the scholastic philosophers, Immanuel Kant, to some extent, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. They have to be brought into psychoanalysis far more than we have done. It's also interesting to see that Dasein has a very ancient precursor to it. Certain schools of philosophy in India, the Hindu schools of philosophy, they do talk of an inquiry very near to Heidegger's flavor of making an inquiry. Inquiry which is based upon uh, an everyday phenomenology, based upon being there, involved in a project, based upon always being in a state of care. Care not in the psychoanalytic sense, care in the sense of Heidegger. And this needs to be brought into psychoanalysis, both I think from existential philosophy and epistemology of the West, and some of the schools of the East which can add to our ordinary understanding of Dasein from Heidegger. In fact, if we put forward a state analysis view based upon chakras, it's a far more illuminating view of Dasein. Not only in description of the present state, but also in creating an account of the past and creating, or rather projecting, a analysis of the future. Not confirmatory, of course, that goes without saying, but the account of the past, present, and future. One way to do it far better than otherwise we do most of the times is by using the theory of chakras. Third theme, which comes from a question related to the split. I keep getting questions related to the Kleinian split. The question asks me about how do I understand or would like to speak on split related to the epistemology of thinking. And I like this question because it brings in epistemology into psychoanalysis, which I am very fond of and I believe must be done more adequately, not done till now. So let us look at split from, I have done this bringing in epistemology into psychoanalysis in the HEAT model. Find it interesting, go there. Some videos on HEAT are there, some more I'll make. So if we bring in epistemology to the concept of Kleinian split, here is how it goes. The first psychological act, cognitive act, is the act of recognizing something, the act of recognition. That you recognize that an object exists. The object may be separate from you, not separate from you, but an object exists. Even in the oceanic state, you can still have objects. In fact, when we think of oceanic state, we think of only the trance-like oceanic state of oneness. But there can be an oceanic state, which is, I should not say an oceanic state, a state between the oceanic state and a full, the other state, where inside the oceanic state slowly objects start appearing, although I and not I are still not in place. So in that sense, the oceanic I gets populated with distinct objects. So the first is, even if you don't go to the esoteric area, even if you talk in ordinary sense, the first is recognition. So the child recognizes that an object exists. Second, epistemological, this is the first epistemological step. As Immanuel Kant would say, using the processes of sensation, perception, we recognize something. And then using the further processes of conception and knowledge, we convert something into knowledge and we know it. So recognition we can talk of in the Kantian sense of sensation and perception. Knowing here can refer to Immanuel Kant's concept of conception. And then comes the stage of knowledge in Immanuel Kant's terms, which we can represent here by the question. You recognize something, you know what it is. That I recognize an apple exists. Something exists of red color. And then I know it's an apple. And then I ask the question, how is it related to me? And here the archetype of the predator plays a role. Because an instinctive question would be, what I see in front of me, is it a predator or can it be my food? Can it help me or can it harm me? Is it a threat to survival or an aid to survival? Is it threat? Is it an opportunity for survival of the species or a threat to the survival of the species? Can it help me reproduce or inhibit the activity of reproduction? So the fundamental drive the thinking. How is it related to me? And as we grow adult and more wise, this question becomes far more scholarly, contextual, and complicated and subjective. But for a child, the first is recognition of an object, knowing the object, asking the question, how is it related to me? And then showing the agency what to do with it. And then comes the question, what is it not? So you can see here, if you talk of the breast, you recognize, you know, you answered the question, how is it related to me? It's giving me all that I want. First, you recognize the breast exists. You recognize, you know you want it. You realize it can give you something. Then you realize all that it can give you, that it is benign. Then what to do with it? So you use it for pleasure, for survival, for psychological attacks. And then you ask the question what it is not. And this question often comes up when it is not there. And then what is its opposite? So this question is generally implicit unconscious. And if everything is unconscious, is deepest part of the unconscious, what it is not. Because this is a very essential epistemological question, but happens deep buried in the brain, in the mind. And then what is its opposite? And here the idea of split comes in. In this epistemological process, if we look at the good breast till here, then here the idea of bad breast emerges. And what can it do to me? Fantasies about the bad breast emerge. And then in the depressive position, the synthesis happens of the good and the bad breast. And then the wisdom comes when we reflect further what to do with the real breast, how to relate to the real breast. And if we look at this epistemological process, we see the split is nothing to be denounced. It is a natural part of the epistemological process. The split happens here. What is its opposite? I know X. What is its opposite? Y. And what can opposite do to me? So it is a natural part of the thinking process. This is how the cognitive thinking of the individual develops. The affective maturity of the individual develops. There is one more question of how poverty is related to mental health. And one way to answer this question is, obviously higher the poverty, more are the troubles in the psychological area, because more are the stresses, less is the access to professional help. The living conditions create more stress. Living is not comfortable. Education is not there. Ignorance creates further problems. So more the poverty, worse is the psychological health. But we should expand the definition of poverty after looking at the economic aspect of poverty to say there is also something called intellectual poverty, artistic poverty, ethical poverty, archetypical poverty, traditional poverty, mystical poverty, and spiritual poverty. So if holistically we define poverty and we want everything, the entire poverty to go, we need enrichment in all these areas, the holistic development. Unfortunately, we are still not done with the first step of poverty, which is economic, and therefore the rest of discussion seems superfluous. But once in the next few decades we do a good job on the economic front, the other aspects of poverty will have to be taken up. And any country's government, if it wants to really do good policy making, it has to look at poverty alleviation in a holistic sense, looking at all these areas. And if the government is still far from doing, then at least the educational institutions and the families should look forward to these areas and create academic curriculum and training to address all the non-economic aspects of poverty, because they can be addressed by academic training, cultural training. Thank you. This brings us to an end of today's class. If you have some questions, let me know. I'll take up those questions either directly as questions or as themes for discussion. See you then. Thank you.